Welcome to episode 6 of Taking Back the Narratives podcast. I am absolutely honored to have on Ariel Grunberg, who I had met on the Gaza Envelope Task Force, which is such a proud committee that we're both on through Jewish National Fund, JNF, for those of you who do know. And additionally, I'm very, very honored to have Ariel be part of my advisory committee through Taking Back the Narrative. So thank you so much, Ariel. And we're going to get into a great conversation for our audience. So the title is American Jewry, How Did We Get Here in Israel? And so it has a double meaning. First, how did each of us respectively get into Zionism, our own views on Israel, and also to assess how overall the American Jewish society, how has it shifted on Israel, positively, negatively, and a little bit of mix of both. So I'll start myself. For those of you who do know my Zionism journey, I'm just going to repeat it as succinctly as I can. For those who are not familiar, I am a first generation American. My parents were proud Zionists in Russia. And growing up in the 60s and 70s, the USSR was vehemently against Israel. It even went so far as to create the false ethnicity of Palestinians. They did that after Israel beat back all of their Arab-backed armies in the Six-Day War. And so I grew up, I had a maternal grandmother who lived in Israel, in Netanya, for about 13 years, but I had no idea that actually I was Jewish. I found out when I was about 7, 8 years old. I had been looking at a TV show, Lassie, and I saw a little boy crossing himself before bed, praying to Jesus. I thought every child across America did that. So I was doing that for a couple of weeks. My father had seen me spontaneously walking by my bedroom. He was shocked. He said, "We need to have a conversation." I found out I was Jewish. And so I really wanted to go to Hebrew school because the Jewish kids in my school were all going to Hebrew school. I had gone to a public school, but he refused. He deemed the rabbi to be too liberal. That's exactly what my family had escaped from in Eastern Europe. And then it was my bar mitzvah year. I was 13 and I had begged for Hebrew lessons, just anything to connect to my religion. Because at that time, I only thought that Jews were only a religion. I did not understand we are a people and a culture. And so my parents said, "We'll do you one better, skip the lessons. We're going to go to Israel. We're going to rent a rabbi." So they eloquently said, as if renting a pair of shoes. And we're going to have your bat mitzvah at the top of Masada. And so we went. It was my first trip to Israel. And I remember feeling this connection that I could not explain to my 13-year-old self, and came back. And from about 13, 14 to about 32, so close to 20 years, I was on a steady anti-Israel diet in the media, right? Like I was watching CNN all the time. I was reading the New York Times religiously. And I believed all the lies, right? That Israel is an occupying force, that there's apartheid, that there's such a thing called settlements, not legal Jewish communities. These settlements are an impediment to peace. Believed all of that. And it culminated with having gone to hear Natan Sharansky, the Jewish hero that he is. So I was fortunate enough to hear him speak, and I wasted the opportunity. I remember just anxiously waiting for his speech to end so I could ask him, why is Israel building settlements? And do they not understand that they're a blockade to peace? So the only reason I was spared embarrassment because another ignorant Jew raised his hand and asked that same question. And of course, Natan said, "There's no such thing as settlements. These are legal Jewish communities. They're not blocking anything." And I left and I felt so betrayed by Natan, thinking, oh, he's just this agent for Israel. And this is Hasbara, this is PR, all a PR ploy. And it wasn't until 2014, the first Hamas war, where I had my aha moment. I had come home from work, turned on CNN as per usual, and I saw that they were only giving airtime to Hamas operatives and no airtime to anyone from Israel. So as much as I wouldn't say I had hate towards Israel. I just was not a Zionist in any sort of way. And also to the point, I spread anti-Israel lies, right? I have a lot of non-Jewish friends that would always ask me when Israel was in the news, hey, I know you're Jewish, can you explain the real deal? And I would repeat the lies I would read, the lies I would hear. And so, but even through that all, something didn't sit well with me, that CNN was not giving airtime to anyone from Israel. And so I had gone on Facebook. At the time, I only had 3 Israeli friends, only online. And what they were showing that was happening in their backyards was not what I was seeing on the news. So that, catapulted me into finding out facts about Israel. Every little fact I would find out, I would post to social media. So it would be maybe one fact per week, turned into a daily fact, turned into just this obsession with the truth. So that was my journey into being a Zionist. And so I turn to you now, Ariel. I really would be fascinated to find out your own Zionism journey and how that transpired.
Sure. So I was born in Tel Aviv, Israel in 1954. And my parents were not Zionists, really. They were business people. And my father had been raised in Palestine. I think he came from Romania in 1935, probably. And my mother came from Kiev, which was then part of the Soviet Union. And she came around the same time, and they met much later in life, but they both spoke Hebrew. They went through the school system. And, at some point, I was three and a half years old. So I guess 1958, 57 half, we went to Venezuela for business opportunities. My parents said it's a hard life in Israel. And so they found they had friends who went there, and so we didn't talk about Israel too much. And I was too young to really appreciate what was going on in Israel at the time, or in Venezuela. Well, we left Venezuela, we came to the United States in 1962, and I was speaking Spanish. I wasn't thinking about Judaism at all. Fast forward, I went back to Israel in 1968, just shortly after the last war there. And I met up with my aunt and uncle, who had partially raised me, because my parents actually left me in Israel in the custody of my aunt, who wasn't married at the time. And I recall attending their wedding. And I have pictures of that. I don't remember it, but really the pictures brought it back. But I had an affinity to my aunt and uncle because I had lived with them for many years. When I got to see my parents for the first time, which was at 3.5, they looked foreign to me. They didn't look like my parents. I didn't recognize them. And I missed my aunt and uncle for a long time. I thought of them as my parents. Any case, so when we went back and I was being bar mitzvah, that was the reason for going back. I also didn't have a Jewish education at home. My parents spoke Hebrew at home, but they didn't impart any religion to us. They were exactly the opposite. They were just, spoke Hebrew, that was it. And didn't talk too much about Israel, but spoke, of course, about it, the family. My aunt, my uncle, my mother's father, my grandfather was there. So finally we went back for my bar mitzvah, and we spent 3 weeks there. And I just loved seeing my cousins. I loved seeing my aunt and uncle, who I thought of as my second family, my second parents. And I think that for me was the beginning of Zionism, more of like a homecoming to my own country. Not in a religious sense, just on an affinity sense. And at that time, I didn't really follow the news about anti-Semitism or anything like that. Didn't know from it. But once I got back to the States, through time, things changed, of course, what was on in the media and everything else. So I would say that was the beginning of my Zionism. I didn't go back to Israel again until I was about 34 years old, because I didn't have a deferment. There was no reason to go back. I was establishing a family. I got married at 23. We had 2 daughters. So I was busy here. Plus, I only had a Venezuelan passport. I didn't have an American passport. So if I left, I wouldn't be able, it wasn't so easy to come back. I had a residency permit. They called it a green card at the time. So that was another issue. And then when I did want to go back, because my grandmother was very ill, I wanted to go back to visit her. The Israeli embassy was giving me a hard time. They said, if you want to go back, my father said, before you do anything, get a deferment. Otherwise, they'll draft you into the army. So I looked into it. I called the embassy and they said to me, you know, you need to have a passport. You can't go to Israel without an Israeli passport. I said, but I haven't been in Israel. I left when I was 3. Well, we'll research it. We'll get back to you. They said, okay, now buy your tickets to the airplane, then we'll give you a passport. I said, I can't go that way. What if you don't give me the passport in time? I can't go because I don't have the pass. If I have the ticket but no passport, I can't go anyway. So I said, okay, I'm not going. So it was many years later after we were married. In 1998, I went back to Israel, and it was amazing. You know, we went from the north to the south. I took my wife everywhere, and you know, once again, fell in love again. And from that moment on, I was, you know, I followed anything Israel did was right.
So you were connected with your heritage. And it's funny you mentioned how they wanted you to get a passport after you bought the ticket. It's just the Israeli way, right? Like everything's so last minute, everything will be fine. I'm noticing now with a lot of Israeli friends that I have in real life, right? Like it's impossible to make friends. It's impossible to make plans with them, you know, like a month out, 2 weeks out, everything is so last minute.
Absolutely.
Of course, you know, and it makes sense, right? Because so many things happening in Israel, Israelis live for the day, right? You know, like you can't plan for a year out. You don't know what's going to happen, right? So make the most of life right now. And it's something I think in a way that Americans can borrow from that culture. So it's interesting. So you said that you had left off in saying that, you know, and since having your return journey to Israel, you started following everything about Israel and you started becoming more involved. So I wanted to talk to you just about, you know, you and I are both for lack of a better words, or I used to say advocates, right? We speak up about Israel. I know you post about Israel. You're very involved, which is one of the reasons I had invited you to be on the Taking Back the Narrative Advisory Committee. I know that aside from JNF, where you're very, you know, very involved and very active, there are a slew of other organizations. Some of them we'll get into a little bit later in the conversation. And so I remember in 2014, when I first started getting into the Zionism space, everyone was saying that they're an Israel advocacy for Israel. There were all these groups labeling themselves advocates. And then I went to Israel in 2015, which was my first time being in Israel as an adult. And actually it was a JNF trip. And I had met an Israeli, I think he was giving a tour to our group somewhere, perhaps Ammunition Hill, but it escapes me right now. It was somewhere around Jerusalem. And he had asked me, so what do you do? And at the time I was working in nonprofit management, but really caring a lot more about Israel advocacy. And I told him, Israel advocacy, I'm an Israel advocate. And he paused and he seemed almost offended by that term. And then he told me, he said, you know, just so you know, a lot of Israelis find that term offensive because it means that, you know, we're this little sibling of America, you know, we can't do anything on our own. We need these American Jews, you know, to advocate for us. And then he also explained from his perspective that the word advocacy is often interpreted as hasbara, right? And so I know a lot of Israelis have no problem with the term hasbara and some do. And the more I personally thought about it over the years, for me, and we can have, you know, a discussion about this, right? Because some people will agree, some people don't. So the way I see it is that, and I worked in advertising for about a year after college with hand in hand with our PR division. So PR, Hasbara, PR, it's all about spinning something, right? It's all about making something that it's not, right? Making a situation better than it is. And so when I really thought about it, Israel has history on its side. It has facts on its side. Is it a perfect nation? Not at all, but no nation is perfect. No nation should be expected to be perfect, right? That's a double standard that's often, unfortunately, levied against Israel. And
Correct.
so I had a conversation with, other people in the space, and we were talking like, well, what do we call ourselves, right? Like, are we Israel advocate? Like, we don't know what we are. And I settled on Zionism educator, right? Because I do share facts about Israel and now with this initiative. And I just call the Zionism space, right? Because we're all pro-Israel and the purpose is education in a way, right? It's like, yes, like we're getting involved, but then it's to share facts on the ground. As unfortunately we saw this past weekend with Operation Breaking Dawn, that was necessary to eliminate the top terrorists that were planning attacks against civilians within Israel. Every other situation that Israel's in also. And so I'm a lot more sensitive these days when I do use the word advocacy, right? Like I use it in very particular purposes, but not to describe what it is that I do. So I just wanted to open up to you and get your take on it. What do you think about those terms and what that gentleman had said?
You have a good point there. In the past, I guess I wouldn't have thought there was much difference between advocacy and Hasbara and also Zionist education or Zionism. But I think that you've touched on a very good point, because when in Israel, an advocate is a lawyer, and what's he supposed to do? He defends. Exactly. Or he attacks. It depends which side he takes. He could be on the suing part, or it could be on the defendant side. But he's an advocate, which means that his position changes depending who he's representing. So it's a good point that for an Israeli, an advocate could be either side, and you're just pushing a narrative, basically. So I could see where an Israeli would be offended by that term or not happy with that term. And it's true that Israel doesn't need defense. Well, everybody needs defending when someone's lying, saying a lie. You need to correct that. And education is very important. And Zionism is a love of our land and reconstituting of our land, of our people in the land. So yes, they need education. Also, a very interesting point is that also the Israelis are very sensitive about feeling that they can't defend themselves. For example, in the South, as part of our JNF Gaza Envelope Task Force, we don't call it a therapy center where kids get help. We call it resiliency center.
I like that name a lot better.
Because it's because they're already strong, but they just need to get a little stronger. And you're improving their resilience. You're not giving them therapy. They're not damaged.
Right. Israelis are not weak. I mean, everything.
Exactly. And that's the point. They're not weak.
Everything. And
they don't like the soundness of weakness. So it's a good point where we want to use the terminology that is acceptable to the Israelis and to the Americans.
No, it's true. And just this morning, I was on Instagram, right, which is often, unfortunately, a hotbed of anti-Semitism. And, without surprise, there was a woman who was pushing, there was a scene about, it was a rocket launched from Gaza, and the people in this town were quickly trying to hide the remnants of the rockets. So then the media wouldn't pick up that it was actually from Gaza, not from Israel. And so I obviously reposted what she said and obviously corrected her using facts. And as I was reposting, I'm thinking, oh, okay, like I have to defend this. And I stopped myself and I thought, what am I defending? I'm just correcting, right? So sometimes it's that semantics.
Yes, a lot of it is semantics. Absolutely.
Right.
It's the way
Because they're
you,
the ones who are defending these false narratives, right? Like they're the ones, like, and it's a visual defense, right? Clearly the rocket fell. Clearly it looks like nothing like Israel would have launched at all. Like it's
right,
very rusty looking, right? The IDF is not known for its rusty missiles, and they're hauling this away. And so she's defending the false actions, right? Like she wants to defend what the narrative is being pushed out.
right,
So I was thinking, like, I'm going to leave it to them to defend their untruths and for us to correct with actual facts. So
correct.
it's interesting, right? Because a lot of people, are, and I see like a lot more people are getting into our space, and first they all call themselves advocates and they're having that internal debate. So I think it's just this journey that a lot of people take. So speaking of journey, I wanted to also talk about what I think perhaps was a pivotal point in Israel American relations, which were the Oslo Accords. So for me, the one of the main reasons I remember it so vividly because it coincided with my first trip to Israel. So it was 1995, and the day we left, I'm sorry, the day before, um, Rabin was assassinated, and we were slated to leave to Israel the next day. And I remember thinking, are we still being able to go? I don't know what's going on. And the more I read, so at first, of course, like a lot of people, I was thrilled with the Oslo Accords, right? Because at my age, anytime peace is associated with any treaty, not knowing any better, I was thrilled. I was like, okay, like, there's peace, there's going to be peace now. But I personally think, and again, this is, I think, a great discussion point, I now call them the Oslo Terrorist Accords, right? Because they stole 2/3 of the Jewish ancestral homeland, Judea and Samaria. It legitimized the PLO and instilled them as a government over Area A and Area B. And I don't, and personally to me, in terms of relations, I think that was the split, right? So, because to me, before the Oslo Accords, it seemed to be a more of a universal support for Israel amongst Jews. And then after the Oslo Accords, looks like there was some kind of, split. Then it turned into a party split, a little bit down the line. So could you give me some insight into your thoughts if the Oslo Accords played any role in how different factions emerged among the American Jewish community, and maybe just a little bit more background into the color that it that it served, like within how American Jews think about Israel, perhaps.
I would take that as two separate discussions, or two separate issues. The Oslo Accords were a total failure in my opinion, because even though it looked like there was going to be peace, it didn't work out that way. Arafat, who was a signer to it, and Rabin, who was a signer to it, with Clinton there when it was signed, everybody thought we were going to have peace. There were certain conditions placed on the Palestinians, that they were not going to incite violence, and they were going to do short joint working with Israel on many facets of society, technology, environmental, joint governorship to some extent in certain parts. Part A, they were going to have complete control, civilian as well as military, or police, I should say. And in Area B, they were going to have civilian control, but not military control. Israel was going to have military control. And in C, it was going to see what happens, and it was going to be decided at a future point within maybe 5 years. But it required the Palestinians to give up trying to wipe Israel off the map, and they didn't do that. They were also not supposed to go to any international bodies and seek Israel's removal of there or destruction or do anything to legitimize their position in forming a nation. That was going to be supposed to be only a discussion between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Also, the Palestinian Authority was supposed to have a legislature, and they were supposed to be liberal and govern.
They have elections, which
yes, elections, and they did have an election, but it was,
it was one.
and once
Mhm.
in 16 years. That's not quite a democracy. So they never lived up to their part. But Israel did live up to a lot of their points that they were supposed to do. And then they waited for the Palestinians to do theirs, but they never did. So it was a waste in the aftermath. We couldn't know then, but we know now that it was a total failure. As far as losing respect for the Jewish homeland, I would say, or the attitudes changing, I would say it went back much further. I would say it started closer to 1974. Because Israel became, but I would go back even further. I would say that things changed mainly on the left, where liberal support for Israel kind of diminished after. Let's go back to the creation of the state in 1948. Mm-hmm. Who pushed for the state of Israel? The Russians. Mm-hmm. The Russians were very keen on having Israel become a nation. Why? Because they were anti-fascist, and they were very, they thought they were going to be communists.
Exactly. They wanted a vassal state.
They wanted, they're going to have kibbutzim, which are communist kind of ruling government in a kibbutz. They thought that was good. The whole country is going to be communist. We'll join, they'll be part of the bloc of communist countries. That'll be great. And the American left, European left felt, well, they're anti-fascist. So we like that. But shortly after it became a nation, things changed. The United States was not keen. You had the defense, you had the military, you had in the United States, you had many different agencies, the Pentagon, the State Department, the intelligence agencies, the Secretary of State. None of these people wanted Israel as a state. They were worried they were going to lose the Arab countries because they hated the idea of the Israeli state. So they felt that we need oil, let's side with the Arabs. But Truman didn't feel that way. He was convinced that this was a good thing, had some help being convinced, but he ultimately voted for Israel to become a state at the United Nations.
And Truman was a Democrat, correct?
That's correct. Mm-hmm. Yes. So that's when I think it began, where the left started to, those that were leftists, meaning more socialists, began, as the Russians and the Islamists, then decided they weren't keen on Israel anymore after it became a state, and they saw that it wasn't communist. So, and then again, after 1974, things changed again. Many people felt now Israel is part of the bigger nations, the first-class nations, the United States, France, England, colonialist power all of a sudden.
So they were no longer
and the Arabs were now the little guys, mm-hmm. and they needed defending. So now the leftists felt, well, we need to give sympathy to the underdog, and who's the underdog? The Arabs, or the Palestinians are the underdog now. So you lost even more people on that point because Israel won the war in 74. It was fairly decisive. And so they felt the little guy now is the Palestinians. We need to support the underdog. So that was in 74. 75, the United Nations decided, with the help of the Russians, that they were going to declare Israel as a racist, Zionism is racism.
Mhm.
That was in 1975. So now you have a whole new group of people who are anti-Israel, the United Nations. Previous to that, they were never friendly, but they weren't, at that point where the Zionism was considered racism. So you had more people on the left, including the Europeans now joining in on that. And I think then you had the BDS in 1988, I think it was, the BDS with Omar Barghouti
Right.
starting the organization. And you lost more people with that because now it became internationalized. During the fall of the Soviet Union, though, you now had Islamists, Russians. Well, the people in the Eastern Bloc became positive for Israel, but you also had a lot in the United Nations where there was still, anti-Israel. So
Yeah.
it's been a progress where we've lost the leftists more and more as time went on.
But it's interesting too, because, and again, you can, fill in some of the points here, but now I'm a proud Republican, but in the past, I was a Republican because my parents were Republican. I didn't really differentiate between Republicans and Democrats because to me, they pretty much stood for the same thing. They work for regulations, they kowtow to some of our enemies. And I personally didn't see a difference on Israel until Obama, right? And so that's why I wanted to talk about the Oslo Accords, because I was thinking, because Clinton was behind the Oslo Accords, did that have something to do with this split on Israel, or is that just my perception, in terms of the parties themselves? Because to me, I thought that before Obama years that both parties were fairly pro-Israel, or is that not true?
I don't know. I know that in the past, and I don't know when the split began. It could be during the Oslo, but it switched. The Republicans were pro-Israel, and the Democrats were not. And then, I'm sorry, the other way around. The Democrats were pro-Israel, and the Republicans were not.
Exactly. And that's one of the
And
reasons.
then that flipped at some point, and it could have been Oslo. That's more like domestic politics as opposed to international. Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
perhaps because Obama, right? Because he was so anti-Israel.
Yes.
And so you had a
Yes.
lot of Republicans who obviously were against Obama on every facet, from domestic issues to foreign
Yes.
issues. So they just saw, well, I don't want to be associated with a party that's supporting everything I cannot stand. So let me now support Israel. That could be one
Right.
explanation.
Also, an interesting point is also during the Obama years, a lot of Democrats really opposed Netanyahu coming and speaking to the Congress.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so you lost a lot of Democrats who supported Israel because they didn't like Netanyahu because he was a conservative.
Right.
So you had also loss of public support for Democrats for Israel because of Netanyahu coming to speak to the Congress, which Obama opposed.
That's true. Right. If it was
And I
like
think so.
Maybe they would have supported at that time.
Yes, possibly, but I think Obama had kind of muddied the water somewhat with a lot of his policies.
Right. He's the one who really put that wedge in. But then we can have a whole separate discussion on libertarians because, technically they consider themselves part of the Republican Party. I don't, but the libertarians, they're vehemently anti-Israel, right? And so when they say like, oh, well, we're isolationists, we don't want any foreign involvement, but yet conveniently, they always cite Israel first, right? How come they don't cite any other country? How come they don't talk about, our massive, surprising foreign aid to Italy? Had no idea that they were in the top 3 that we give money to, or Egypt or any other country, right? And what they don't understand is what makes Israel truly special. When there are wars in Israel, there are no American boots on the ground, right? But when there's wars in every other part of the world, for the most part, we're asked to sacrifice our soldiers. And so I still am trying to figure out psychologically, like, why is it that libertarians always harp on Israel? But again, that could be a whole,
That could be anti-Semitism, I believe, and
yeah,
it
it
may
could
not
be.
have anything to do with the country Israel
Yeah,
or aid. I believe that Ron Dermer summed it up very well, that the U.S. gets much more from Israel than it gives. I mean,
absolutely.
the money that we give to Israel is spent in the United States. That's one of the requirements of the military aid to Israel, is that 90% of it is spent here. So we empower the defense industry to create all this weaponry. We keep them in business. Israel does, that is, by buying all these munitions from here. And then who tests it for them? It's not the workers that make this stuff. It's Israel.
Exactly. And
Test
then,
everything. They test everything, and they report back to them
mhm.
whatever they find, so they can improve on the next model, or even make improvements before they produce the next one,
Yeah,
the
they
next
get free,
plane.
exactly, they
So
get free research and development from
yes,
Israel, and at the cost of Israel's own defense,
yes,
industry that's getting sidelined because they have to keep buying from the US. And again, we can have a whole separate discussion. I know that within Israel, there's conversations about, well, maybe we should stop relying on American military aid because our own industrial complex is not being advanced enough. But it's
it's
something,
exactly the opposite. It is
right?
more so because of Israel. The other countries that buy weapons, they don't improve on them.
No,
Israel
absolutely.
does. They take out the avionics on the planes and they put in their own because they feel theirs is better than the Americans. And then
Right.
they tell them what
And then they
improvements they've
give it to
made
us.
over it. And they say, aha, well, that's a good idea. Why don't we do that?
Absolutely. And so speaking of military, so I know that you're involved with JINSA. So how has it shown, what has it shown you about Israel's military position within the Middle East, among the world at large? And can you go into a little bit more detail in what JINSA stands for, what kind of organization it is? I
Sure.
know that I'm fascinated every time you talk about that organization, the trips that you take, the meetings that you have. So, maybe we could touch upon the trilateral relations between the US and Israel and the wider Middle East.
Sure, sure. So JINSA is the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. It's dedicated to educating congressional, military, and civilian national security decision makers on American defense and strategic interests, primarily in the Middle East, which is a robust U.S. security. We have robust security cooperation. That's, as you were saying earlier, the U.S. doesn't have to send troops to the Middle East. Israel defends the Middle East for the United States and serves the interests of the United States, which very few other countries do, because Israel is so close to the U.S. in both outlook, type of people. We all believe in democracy, rule of law. And so we represent, Israel represents the U.S. in the Middle East, and it does a great service. So to keep it well armed is extremely important. And that's what JINSA does. It requests from the U.S. as part of their advocacy or part of their educational thing with congressional leaders is specific military equipment that Israel needs and should have from the U.S. to better protect the United States in the Middle East. JINSA believes that the American military national security posture is the best guarantor of peace and the survival of our values and civilization in that part of the world. So JINSA has been around for about 40 years. It's an expert in security matters. Through the organization, they have a foundation, and this foundation that was set up provides for bringing in retired American military experts, mostly generals and admirals, lieutenant generals, major generals, and they work with the JINSA organization as a think tank and put out policy positions. And they introduce these to the media, to Congress, to the Oval Office. I can't say the Oval Office right now listens to too much, but Congress does. And very often they will work with some of the ideas that JINSA produces. Now, on a personal note with JINSA, I've traveled with them to Egypt, and we met with the president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. We met also with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense. We also had the media there. They called the media in. They were there for about 5 minutes. They took pictures and they ran out. And that's what happens sometimes in a dictatorship.
Right.
But they weren't there the whole time. But they were given later a report of what was discussed, and they took it from there. So anyway, our picture was in the newspaper.
Wow.
But they fashioned it, interestingly enough, as cooperation between the U.S. and Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't mention Israel once in the paper, other than to say that this is a Jewish organization, Jewish Institute for National Security of America, but it didn't mention Israel at all in that. And there's a reason for that. I think we could cover that a little later, perhaps, that different Arab countries who've made peace with Israel have done it for different reasons and at different levels of cooperation.
Actually, we can get into it a little bit right now because.
Okay, I would like to do that. I would like to do that with respect to Egypt.
Exactly. So I would love to start with Egypt because I can start with my sheer confusion, right? So of course I understand the utmost hostility that Egypt had for Israel, but then suddenly you had Sisi come in throughout the Muslim Brotherhood. Morsi, was that his name? Right?
Yes, Morsi.
Morsi threw him out, and so to me, it looked, and to many others, it seemed like he was doing more against Hamas than even Israel at times, right? They were flooding the tunnels with sewage. They built a steel wall, against Gaza. They're the ones who closed border crossings with Gaza, right? Their Rafah crossing is only open during Ramadan. I've been to the border crossing just recently on the Israel side, the Erez crossing. It's open every single day, except of course when there's an uptick in hostilities. And even then, after the weekend, they just opened it up the very next day. So I thought that Sisi was very much pro-Israel. I thought that he, being the intermediary between Israel and Hamas when there's increasing conflict. And even, wasn't it Sisi who even thought of that idea? I know that it was retracted from the media, but I thought it was a genius idea. He said, you have all these issues with, so-called Palestinians, obviously no such thing as a Palestinian people. But so his suggestion was, why don't you move the Arabs from Judea and Samaria, bring them closer to the people in Gaza, and I'll give you the Sinai, right? As long as Israel and other international community members develop that region. The Sinai is basically a headache for Egypt, right? It has a lot of, drug dealings. It has a lot of terrorist activities. And so economically, it would benefit from them. So again, like I'm reading all these positive reports, Sisi and Israel, but there's no normalization. Seems to be no avenue at this point for normalization. So could you maybe fill in that background a little bit more? What's happening? What is Sisi really doing? And is there a path forward for normalization, or is there not?
Well, there's peace with Egypt, and I think it will change slightly. I think it'll move much slower than with the UAE, with trade and everything else. I think now that Sisi sees that it is possible for other countries to work with Israel, I think he'll step his game up. But he has to be very worried because their educational system still maligns Israel. And when they change that, like they've been doing in Saudi Arabia, then it's possible to have a more normalized relationship in trade and tourism and that type of thing. Right now, it's just military to military cooperation. I think the problem in Egypt is that they haven't changed their educational system, but also the Arab street hates Israel because of what they, because the shows on TV and the other things. They always need a boogeyman in a dictatorship.
But does he
And
think
in the past,
I'm
in the
sorry.
past, the boogeyman was the Muslim Brotherhood. They always allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to have a small presence in Egypt until Morsi became their leader. And then the people got to see how bad the Muslim Brotherhood was. And so they overthrew them with the military. And Abdel Fattah Sisi was a general in the military, and he overthrew the Morsi government, which was Muslim Brotherhood. So now they eliminated most of the top tier Muslim Brotherhood leaders in Egypt. Some of them went into hiding, most of them they arrested, they killed them, or left them in jail. So that boogeyman has been removed. So they still need another one. So Israel is still kind of a boogeyman to the Arab street. And since they haven't accepted Israel, you can't have a normalization. That has to come from the top. The government has to say, we're changing our educational system. Israel's not our enemy. Iran is our enemy. And then things will improve. And I think it's been the problem with the government there.
That's so interesting, right? Because it's quite the opposite now with Saudi Arabia, right? So
Exactly.
Yeah, the words are still anti-Israel, but their actions are very much pro-Israel, right?
It's the educational system.
Exactly.
It's starting from education, and it's like, in the United States when we started. It's just another interesting point. Many years ago, when my daughter started to learn to play soccer, a lot of people said, who needs to learn soccer? Basketball, baseball, football, this is the sport that Americans do. But, we wanted to be on the world stage with soccer like everybody else. We wanted to introduce it. So now everybody knows about soccer. A lot of people watch soccer. A lot of high school kids are playing soccer and college. So it starts from education from a young age. And if you start the educational system from very young, it'll be accepted by everybody later on, a few generations later.
But don't these leaders have the power, well, like you said, to change their education system?
Yes.
I know that you had just gone to travel to the UAE. I had just gone to the UAE and I had met with one of our tour guides, full hijabi Muslim, very proud. And she told me the truth. She said, I grew up and in my history books, Israel was nowhere to be found on the map. It did not exist, right? And she had said that she was convinced that Jews had horns, that Israelis were all devils. And in such a short amount of time, as soon as the Abraham Accords were signed, she had been working with this travel agency that she's still part of. And suddenly her clients are Jews from all over the world and Israelis. And she, through dialogue, well, first of all, she has no choice because if she wants to be employed with this travel agency, she has to work, with Israelis and Jews from everywhere. But also her mind explicitly changed through these dialogues in person. And so she has a daughter, 12, 13 years old. And she said that she knows that within a year or two, Israel will be on the map in the history books. It's already talked about so positively. And so I'm just thinking, and also, like you said, in Saudi Arabia, right, they made such a concentrated effort to erase anti-Semitic lies in their textbooks. I know that they're clamping down on imams that are anti-Semitic. And so with Egypt, what you said was so interesting, that they need that boogeyman, right? But then what's the difference between Egypt needing that boogeyman, right? That scapegoat, which is Israel, and Saudi Arabia, right? Because all of them are dictatorships. Like we had just gone to the UAE.
True.
And so nothing is more of a dictatorship than the UAE.
Let me answer that question.
Yeah.
So each of the Gulf nations is in a different position vis-a-vis Iran.
Oh, okay.
So it has more to do with Iran than it has to do with Saudi Arabia-Israeli relations. I think that they're changing because they need Israel's help.
So the enemy of your enemy is your friend, basically.
It's Israel can defend them or can help them defend themselves. Israel has a technology. Israel has the history. Israel is a strong horse in the Middle East. And you always, as an Arab culture, a tribal people, you look for the strong guy to be aligned with,
Right.
because that person can help you, or you can learn from them, or, you know. So I think that with Saudi Arabia, well, no, Saudi Arabia is still very slow to become part of the Abraham Accords, and it may take a little while, but they're certainly moving in that direction of working with Israel and not painting Israel as the devil like they used to.
Right.
Saudi Arabia used to support the Wahhabi sect, which is a pretty extreme form of Sunni Muslim practice, and they would fund madrasas all over the world,
Especially in
Pakistan,
right?
and many other places, and they're not doing that anymore. They saw what the Muslim Brotherhood has become, and they were part of the reason why Muslim Brotherhood did well. So by stopping to fund them, they're cutting back on their malign activities against Israel. So let me get back to the Gulf countries. So Bahrain is the closest one to Iran.
Mhm.
It's like about 450 miles away from Iran. Very, very close. They want military cooperation with Israel. And they've said, we'll sign an agreement with Israel. You know, we're ready to accept Israel on the military level, not just economic. UAE is exactly the opposite. We want to have cooperation with Israel on civilian things. We want to do trade. So in May, they signed an agreement, May of this year, that they will do $10 billion worth of trade within 5 years. It's historic.
Exactly.
Never happened before with an Arab country that they've gotten to that level of trade. I mean, the trade with India is like 6 billion. And here we're talking about 10 billion in 5 years. Historical. So UAE is a little hesitant to do military cooperation with Israel because they're afraid of Iran attacking them.
Mhm.
So they're saying, well, it's just business. We're not really, doing anything. We're not doing anything militarily against you, Iran. They have business with Iran also. So they need to be kind of seen as neutral on the military side. So that's their position. Saudi Arabia is very worried, but as I said, Saudi Arabia is taking a little while because they have to prepare the Arab street, just like Egypt has to. And they've already started to do that. They're progressing much quicker than Egypt ever did. And I think that's why I think it's going to happen, but they need to do it slowly. Morocco, no problem.
Right.
Morocco has 1 million descendants living in Israel who came from Morocco. And there's a big Jewish population there. A lot of Jews go back to Morocco, back and forth. It's almost like Russia. There's, big Russian population in Israel too. And they go back and forth. Right. So the previous 1999, I think, to maybe from earlier on to 1999, the previous ruler of Morocco was had warm relations with Israel. And I think his son, Mohammed VI, is currently also, and he's the one who signed the Accords, I believe, with Israel.
And what is the street in Morocco like? Because I have some friends.
It was never so bad as the other Arab countries, I think.
I do want to ask though, because I have some friends who've recently been to Morocco who are of Moroccan heritage, and they share that they experienced anti-Semitism there. They were pressured to either convert to Islam, or they saw, I believe, right outside the shuk there was some they saw like even Nazi paraphernalia. And so even a Muslim Zionist that I'm friends with, he said, you have the main streets, and then you round the corners, and there is anti-Semitism there. So is that going to improve, you think, like as the trade deals increase, as the Abraham Accords go on? Or do you think that there's always going to be that element there?
Well, there's always going to be an element in every look. Even in the United States, we have
Right.
anti-Semitism here. You have strong support from the Republicans for Israel, and you have some Democrat support for Israel. It's individual, but I was recently in Barcelona 2 weeks ago. We were there for 10 days. We went into an Arab restaurant for dinner, and when we finished, it was about 1:30 in the morning, and we needed a taxi to get back to the hotel. The guy who was the bouncer, because they have entertainment as well, there was a bouncer outside, really big guy, and he said, "Well, I'll get you a taxi." And I speak Spanish fairly fluent, so I said, "Great, thanks." So we went across the street, waited for a taxi. So I asked him, "Where is he from?" He said he's from Morocco. And he says, "Where am I from? Where's my parentage?" He said. I told him my father's Romanian, my mother was from Kiev. And he says, "But I was born in Israel." He says, "Oh, we have great relations with Israel. All citizens respect each other. It doesn't matter where you come from or what your religion is. We all respect each other. And we're all Moroccans." And that's the way it is. So interesting point.
Yeah,
He
it
said
depends.
it's not the case.
Exactly. It depends, I think, on people's interactions. And also I've noticed that online, I'm friends with Berber Moroccans, or like the Amazigh people, and they're very, very pro-Jewish. They're very pro-Israel. They feel this kinship with the Jews and actually have an anti-Arab sentiment just because, their
Yes.
country was conquered.
Right,
So
right.
interesting. And so when you talk about Saudi Arabia, and I know that they're holding off, first of all, I know that they control the Gulf, right? So the other
Yes,
Abraham Accord countries would not even be allowed to touch
correct,
Israel had it not had explicit permission from Saudi Arabia.
correct.
But my thinking is this: is Saudi Arabia going to wait for America to get involved to sign an agreement with Israel? And my personal prediction is, I would say 2 years from now, like a year and a half to 2 years. Or is it going to deal directly with Israel without the US?
Well, I think that all the other countries got something from the US.
Mhm.
And why would they want to not get something from the US?
That's a good point.
They'll feel left out if they'll say we didn't do a good bargain.
True. Very.
So I think that they want recognition that Saudi Arabia is not bad. Like, what happened to Qassemani was, is an issue, but it's could be swept under the rug also, because we have a bigger interest in the Middle
Oh,
East.
you mean to Khashoggi, right? The
Yes, to
journalist.
Khashoggi.
Yeah.
Right. When I meant
Okay.
Khashoggi.
I actually think that, I'm not for murdering journalists, of course, but at the same time, he was a terrorist supporter.
Yes, he was
I
on the wrong side of things anyway.
Exactly. He wasn't really a journalist, so to speak. It's
No.
that female journalist that worked also for Al Jazeera that was killed by Arab fire in Judea and Samaria, right? That they're saying, oh, it's attacking journalists. Like she was a pro-terrorist supporter and a very vocal one. So I
Yeah.
think that politics get in the way when describing
Yes. Yes.
accurate job titles. So no, but that's a good point. So actually, if you could remind our audience, do you know what a lot of these countries got in return from the US? I mean, I know with Kosovo,
No.
they got recognition from Israel that it's an independent country, right? It's not part of Serbia. But I actually forget what.
Well, let's talk about Sudan for a minute.
Right, exactly. Well, what did they get in return?
Okay, so what Sudan got was being taken off the terrorist list.
Oh,
They were
yes,
a terrorist
I remember.
supporter country. So by allowing them to get off that list, they can now have business with other countries. Countries can invest in Sudan. They can appear to be more moderate, even though it's controlled right now by the military. And they haven't, they're waiting to have elections there. But as long as they're off the terrorist list, they can borrow money. They can, have investments, and I think they'll be looked at more favorably in the world as a non-terrorist supporting nation. So I think that's what Sudan got.
That's true.
And I don't think they were that keen on making peace with Israel.
No.
They wanted to get off the terrorist list.
Right. They just said, where do I sign? What do I need to have to do? What do I need to just, have a mouthpiece and let's end the deal right now.
Exactly.
And then, so something that has been in the news, of course, with the war in Ukraine and Russia, we see that Russia now has aligned very much so with China. India is in that new superpower mix, Brazil, UAE, like basically all these countries that did not vote in the UN, against Russia. And so Israel is put in this quagmire of a situation, right? So I know that
Yes.
what's morally they're against one country invading another country, whether reasons could be valid or not. The way that Russia went about it, of course, is incomprehensible. But so when I look at Israel now, they look at America under Biden, they look at Europe, and they see weakness, right? I mean, everything that this administration touches, along with Europe and NATO, it's a disaster, right? The pullout from Afghanistan to every other foreign policy decision. And unfortunately, the new superpowers, in my observation, is that new axis, right? And so what does Israel do? So on one hand, it needs Russia for its military operations in Syria, right? To
Right.
these weapon caches coming from Iran. But on the other hand, I know that it would never abandon America completely. So what does Israel actually do geopolitically, geostrategically, right? And I know that Israel is not actually a full ally of America. I found that out shockingly. I remember being at a Emmett gala, and when was it, 2019, and Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham, was there, and he said, "Oh, we don't have a formal agreement with Israel. We need to sign one because when Hamas attacks Israel, America needs to be there. America needs to put boots on its ground." And we're all clapping because of course we want an agreement with Israel. And
Yes.
then weeks later, there was an Israeli general, maybe actually from Jinsa, I forget at the moment, and he said that would be a terrible idea because he said, first of all, we sell arms to countries that the US would never approve. We need to make money somehow. We need to have our own alliances. And given the situation that we're in with all of our enemies, we can't wait for America to make decisions for us, right? Like we need to act like we saw this past weekend at a moment's notice. Like we can't have Congress approve of our actions. And so where does that leave Israel, especially right now, right? Like, does it pivot more towards China and Russia? Does it, I don't know, could you give some color on this?
Yeah, well, I would say that not just on military, but also in cooperation on civilian matters and trade, Israel and India are doing phenomenal. They're doing $6 billion worth of trade annually now. A lot on the military side. Israel's providing drones, I believe, to India,
Right.
because they have a big problem with Pakistan on the northern border. And so Israel has very good relations with India on agriculture as well. Israel's providing them a lot of technology and helping them with also even with production of milk with cows and everything. Israel's like the world leader in getting in milking cows. I mean, they have more gallons of milk per cow than any other country, I think, and they do that with conservation of water. So India needs it's a poor country, relatively speaking, because of its population. It's rich on population, but not so much on other matters. So Israel's very helpful to India, and they have common interests. It's a democracy also. So, and China, Israel's doing great work with China as far, on technology and trade and stuff like that. Nothing on military.
Right.
I don't think that it's transactional. Their relationship with China is purely transactional. They don't have, I don't think they expect to be seeing eye to eye on politics or anything else. It's a different type of country.
Right, but they're involved
In
in
the
the
US.
Road Initiative, although I know that the Haifa port, I think now is Indian owned, but before it was
Yes.
Chinese owned.
Correct.
So I know that America had some issues with Jerusalem, like over that, but at the same time,
Yes.
Israel needs to look out for its own interests, right? And so
Correct.
first of all, physically, Israel is in Asia physically, and it needs alliances as well. So I think perhaps Israel, like you said, at least through transactional means, it's looking to align beneficially, for itself.
Sure, it needs to do that. And I believe that's why most of the Gulf nations want to have a relationship with Israel. It's a lot of it is to do to counteract Iran, because they fear Iran tremendously. And I believe that's where the impetus was to have the Abraham Accords in that region. It was the Iran issue more than anything else.
It's true, and it's a very Machiavellian, a situation, right? The enemy of your enemy is your friend, and
Correct.
that's interesting, right? It's like, had it not been for Iran's genocidal means and tactics, the Abraham Accords would not have happened. Of course, we would, probably want, a friendlier Iran in absence of these accords, because that probably would have happened more naturally anyway. But the means to arrive at the accords is what it is, and perhaps they can all settle it together and eventually do have a military allegiance to each other,
Yes.
and then conquer. But then again, I personally, I feel badly for a lot of the Iranian population, right? It's not that the West and Israel or the UAE or Saudi Arabia, they're not against the people of Iran. Most of the Iranians are against its own regime.
Absolutely. And that's one of the big failings of the Biden administration, is they've not done anything to support the local people, the people who would gladly rise up against their government if they had support from overseas, whether it's military or even saying we back you, we will help you some way. They don't say anything. They says, well, no, we want to deal with the mullahs. We want to deal with your oppressors. And that's what we do. We talk to them about making deals and offering them money so that they continue to build weapons.
Right. None of that money is going to anyone living in Israel at
not
all.
going to the people in Iran, and we're
going to the IRGC. That's where it's going.
Yeah, they control 60% of the operation of the country. They have their foot in every company, in many of the big companies in the country, and then they make money from operations.
Exactly. So I know that we did not touch up on this off record, but what do you personally see happening with Iran, let's say 5-10 years from now? Do you see the regime still being there? Do you see that there is an operation to remove the regime in a certain manner? What's your take on it?
I think it's just a question of time before the regime collapses. They're not liked by the people, and they can't keep everyone down forever. I think the people will rise up, but hopefully with another administration, it'll be more supportive of the people, and it'll happen, and we won't have to have a war with them. I think if we can overthrow this regime, I think things will settle down, because the people are pro-American, pro-Israel.
Oh, they're very pro-West. In fact, oddly enough, I have a following in Iran that follow my pro-Zionism pages, and not just to troll, but like they're actually learning and they're reposting. And I had many conversation online, and I said, are you an isolated case on Israel? And they said no, like so many Iranians are very pro-Israel. And in fact, I don't know if our audience has seen, but there's a video or several videos. The regime puts out the Israeli flags and American flags side by side. They burn them, or they have college age students and high school students like step on those flags in a disrespectful manner. And there's an onslaught of videos with students sidestepping the flag.
I've seen that also. Yes, I saw a video like that a couple of months ago, where they put a flag down. They wanted people to burn it or step on it. They wouldn't do it.
Yeah, they're just like tiptoeing and being very inconvenienced by it. And just, it's so, because again, like I think I know a lot of Americans take our freedoms for granted, right? As much as there is suppression of speech lately, but we still don't have it, of course. It's still not a complete dictatorship.
Yes, correct.
And so many people in other countries that defy their regimes just as something simple as not slipping on a flag, who knows, that could have been jail time for them. So these
Yes,
people need to be applauded for
absolutely.
sure. Yeah, so I would love to conclude just on those who want to get more involved in Israel organizations and the Zionism space that we're both involved. Do you have any personal advice or recommendations?
Oh,
Favorite organizations?
mhm.
Mhm.
So I have a lot of organizations that I financially support, and many of them I take a personal interest in, and I work with them, where I spend time and effort. Of course, Jewish National Fund is the top of my list in terms of time spent.
Mhm.
I go to Israel frequently. I visit our affiliates in Israel. I'm involved in the Gaza Envelope Task Force. I'm involved with the Housing and Development Fund. I'm on the McCore. I'm a McCore member, which is part of their ambassadorship speakers bureau for JNF. And I'm also a Long Island board member.
Wow.
So all this is part
Very
of
impressive.
just one organization, Jewish National Fund. So that all that takes a lot of time.
Right.
But I'm also involved with Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, um, known as CAMRA.
Mhm.
And I'm on their advisory board, New York Advisory Board also. They're a wonderful organization. They monitor and see corrections of false information given by the media. And that could be print media, it could be virtual media, TV, radio, you have it. So they're a wonderful organization. I also support the Middle East Forum, which is a think tank.
And we'll need to talk off record about that because I have a meeting with them. So we'll chat later.
Okay, that they're a great organization, love them. And I have lunches very often with some of the they come to New York. Well, they're based in Philly, I think.
Yes. Mhm.
And they do travel to different cities sometimes, and they'll have like a talk on a specific subject. It could be Iran, it could be South America, and Hezbollah in South America. Anyway, I do join them for that. They have great lunches when they do come. So another one that which you mentioned also, I met, which is the Endowment for Middle East Truth, and that's Sarah Stern.
Also a great organization.
And that's a great think tank, and they're advocates for Israel in Congress. Also, they do make the rounds in Congress.
I think
Similar to what AIPAC does, but more
a little bit more effective, I think.
Yes, a little more effective and more
Truthful.
They don't have to represent both sides at the same time.
Yeah.
They don't have to represent the liberal and the conservative views. So Ahmed is more to the right of AIPAC, which is a more centrist, I would say, and slightly leaning to the left.
I also like to say that I know for my own initiative, Taking Back the Narrative, people, say like, oh, like it's a right wing, it's not left wing. And I say that there should be no politics when it comes
There is
to
no politics with AIPAC.
Yeah. Well,
but a lot of, but they have to accept, but they have to accept both parties. So if the Democratic Party is swinging leftwards slightly, they also have to be able to accommodate them.
And that's right. And that's what
makes
the
tent.
Right. And so like to me, that makes it problematic, right? Like when you have to talk about, to me, it's an anti-Semitic two-state solution. It's not basing Israel reality, it's not basing anything on the reality.
It's not the reality at the time. There's no two-state solution now.
Right. And so what Emmett does, like you said, it's a more realistic legislative approach, right? So Sarah goes in with more of the facts without having some kind of fantasy that's never going to come true based not on reality. So
correct.
Yeah, I also support
you're absolutely right on that. I also support United Hatzalah, which is a rescue organization in Israel, where they are purely volunteer and get all their support from donations from people like me and many others. They rescue people who've had car accidents or what have you. They call their central hub in Jerusalem, and they send out one of their 6,000 volunteers anywhere in the country. And these people are Druze, they're Christians, they're Muslims, they're religious Jews, and secular Jews, all parts of society. And it's interesting that in the Jewish religion, if you're Hasidic and it's Shabbat, if it's a question of rescuing someone's life, you can go out there, get on a bike, electric bike, and do a rescue, and it's not forbidden by law. So all society members are partake in this, and it's just a great organization. And I've seen the camaraderie between the people. They work together, and when they go on a call, they don't just send out one, they send out anyone's in the region. So you can have in that area. So they do it within 3 minutes also. So you may have 3 people arriving. One could be Christian, one could be Muslim, one could be Jewish. So it's just wonderful to see that type of relationship in Israel. You don't see that ever advertised in the local media in the United States.
It has to be, because speaking of these emergency services, I was just on a trip with American Friends of Magen David Adom. They also do emergency services. And there was a story about 4 months ago that 2 of their Muslim volunteers got married, and they had said that they never would have met had it not been for Magen David Adom. That's Israel for you.
That is. And it's I also, getting back to other organizations I support that are wonderful. I support the NCSI, which is National Conference of Synagogue Youth of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. Very long name. They do educational things for kids that are in junior high and high school. They take them to APAC conferences. They take them to Israel. They get to see things. And so I support them also. I think it's a wonderful thing to start with the youth, because before they get brainwashed by the things that go on by politics and the media and everything else. I also support United Nations Watch. Great organization.
Oh, with Hillel
Newer, yes. I've been supporting them for about 10 years now. And I've been to the UN a few times when they've had meetings there with some of their dissidents who speak about their trials and tribulations in these dictatorships.
He's so powerful. Do you remember? I don't know if you were there, but it was I forgot it was the son of Hamas, right? There was a whole movie called The Green Prince, and he was a guest of UN Watch, and he excoriated all of the Arab countries, and he said, where are your Jews, right? First Hillel said that, like, where are your Jews, Egypt? Where are your Jews, Libya? Where are your Jews, Tunisia? And then they had the son of one of the Hamas leaders just go line by line and go against every lie that is in the media. He's
known as a Green Prince.
Exactly. It's a great documentary for anyone who would like to that. I believe it's on Netflix, or I'll link.
I think recently he's moving from the US to France or someplace. I read, I'm not sure why, but he's been in the news lately, and I've heard him speak a few times. He spoke in front of APAC, I believe, at one of our breakfasts.
He's incredible, and the work that he helped with Israel.
He worked for the Mossad, and his condition for working was that they would not kill his father, and who was a high-end Hamas operative, but that they wouldn't kill him as a result of anything that Israel was doing to protect Israel, but he was a great intelligence to the Mossad about things that were going on with Hamas. So PragerU is another one that I think is wonderful for students to learn about Israel and about conservative values and things like that, which the media is distorting very often. Great organization. Of course, Taking Back the Narrative. I'm so happy to be involved with you.
So
this
honored to have
organization.
you on the board. I was thrilled when you had said yes.
Thank you. Also, Palestinian Media Watch, another
Yes.
good organization. I get a lot of information from them because they translate what is being said in the Palestinian society or Palestinian Authority, I should say, the PLO. Whatever they say, they translate, and they follow the money and showing where their money goes, especially to fund previous terrorists that the Palestinian Authority supports with funds for killing Jews. A lot of people don't know that or don't read it, and they produce all this stuff on a daily basis almost, it seems. Also, I read JNS, which is the Jewish National Syndicate. Jonathan Tobin runs that organization, and they put out a lot of news on what's going on also, and commentary also,
Oh, I
editorial.
love commentary. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's always spot on, in my opinion.
Very insightful on what's going on.
Yes.
Especially, I like the analysis between Israeli policy, US policy, puts it all together, puts in perspective.
Yes.
So what we're going to do, I'm going to, when this podcast episode is going to be published, we are going to link all the organizations mentioned just for it to be another resource.
Sure.
So,
That's a good
Ariel,
idea.
thank you so much for your time. Thank you for
Sure.
your insight. And again, it is such a high honor having you part of Taking Back the Narrative. This is just the beginning. And we have a lot more exciting programming in store from Zionism education. There's going to be a fall class coming up called Israel Reclaimed. Israel Explained. And it's going to be geared towards fellow Israel Zionists, also online influencers to firm up their knowledge base a little bit more about historical facts. We're going to be continuing these podcasts. There's also going to be a Muslim Zionist roundtable discussion on the heels of these Abraham Accords. So there's a lot of work to be done, and it's just great to have incredible people involved such as yourself. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a good day, everyone.
You too.